Hey everyone, my name's Dom, welcome back to the channel. Today it's time for a top 10 and this one is the big one. This is the first edition of my top 10 favourite fantasy series. So that's right, I've procrastinated for long enough and it's finally time for me to give you my top 10 fantasy series. Now, one of the reasons I've been putting this off for so long is because I've had such a difficult job compiling this list in the first instance, but ultimately it's a list of my top 10 favourite series, and I'd been looking at various different criteria and trying to weigh up different series against each other, but forgetting that kind of sole purpose of looking at my favourite series. So I've revisited my list and I've managed to narrow it down to my current 10 favourite completed series. This is the first edition, and although I may not renew this list every year, I fully expect that at least next year there will be some changes to this list, possibly changes in the ordering of titles that are already on here as my feelings change over time, but also with new entries coming on for existing series that I finish and also for series that are not yet complete but do have a final book coming out soon. So those two elements there are pretty much the only criteria for a series to be considered for this list. It must be a completed series and I must have read all of the books, so completed by both the author and by myself. Now, traditionally these lists will run in reverse order from 10 to 1. I think for my list there might be a bit more tension running it the other way around from 1 to 10, because if you know me and if you know my channel, you've seen some of my videos, you can probably take a good guess at what's going to be right at the top of the pile. But we will start with number 10, and with that said, let's dive on in. So in at number 10 we have The Chronicles of the Unhewn Throne by Brian Staveley. This is really interesting. It does mix political and military fantasy into the one tale, where you've got a family who are fighting for control of their empire. The main part that I like about this is actually the military side of it. I don't normally like the kind of military school setting, but I thought it was well done in this particular novel and I had no issues with it. Part of that was because it was really interesting in the way that it happened. Not only the traditional trials that you tend to have in these school kind of settings, which I thought was a really interesting twist on it and gave us some good development later on in the story, but I also really like the actual military aspect of it itself. Rather than just being regular soldiers or knights or anything along those lines, these soldiers are Ketrel and they take their name from a giant bird that they ride into battle. Now, normally when you imagine that, you probably are thinking of a single bird with a single rider on top, but these birds are so massive that instead of that you get 4 or 5 warriors suspended by harnesses of these great birds. So that adds a really interesting kind of group dynamic to these warriors as well as they're going into battle. The magic in these stories is another really interesting aspect, where you have magic users called leeches who each have a well and they can leech kind of thoughts and feelings and emotions from people to make themselves more powerful. So if a leech has happiness, for instance, as their well, they will be able to draw off the happiness of the people around them, and if everyone around them is having a really good time and they're in high spirits, then the leech will become more powerful because they will be able to fill their well with those emotions from the people around them. So again, that's a really interesting aspect that gives us some great development as the story goes on. Now, I did feel like the opening book in the series, The Emperor's Blades, was the strongest of the 3, but overall it's a really good trilogy. Number 9 on my list is a new entry for me. It's one of the series that I most recently completed, and that is the Kreidik Sagas, a self-published trilogy by Alicia Wanstel-Berg. This one had some fantastic character moments in it, and although I felt that book 1 and book 2 weren't as strong as they could have been, book 3 made up for that in spades, and the series itself was greater than the sum of its parts. It's one of those series where, when considered as a whole, it really brings up the kind of overall enjoyment of those slightly weaker first 2 books. What I really like about this one is the development of those characters as we go through from the start of our story to the end, where initially we have a main character, Lidan, who is a 13-year-old girl wanting to be a warrior, just in the early stages of starting to ride, starting to fight, starting to go out with the rangers in her clan. And then as we move forward, she grows up into a great warrior, and there are various touch points along the way where we can see changes that are instigated in Lidan, and that is really superbly done. Again, there's some interesting magic in this series with some elements that I've not really seen elsewhere, which I thought were really well done. And overall, where we start with some real promise in book 1, in book 3 the author really delivers, and it all ties together quite nicely with some really great nods in that final book to things that are happening in the first book. So I like the way it's all pulled together, and overall it made for a really compelling series. In at 8 on my list is the Dark Elf trilogy by R.A. Salvatore. This is the kind of origin story, if you like, of one of my favourite, if not my absolute favourite, fantasy character, Drizzt Do'Urden, the titular Dark Elf. I really love here how we see the background not only of Drizzt himself, but of his family, his home life. You see the Dark Elf kind of undercity of Menzoberranzan, and that was a really interesting development for me. I loved the different kind of aspect that we get from the undercity. It's not something that you tend to see too often in fantasy. And to be honest, most of the times that I personally have seen it, it always seems to be a dwarven undercity, and this gives some very different elements. The other thing I like here is just seeing how things develop, seeing how Drizzt takes a different path from what's expected of him as a Dark Elf, and the decisions that he takes that lead him to where we initially meet him looking at Publication Order, which is the Icewind Dale trilogy. There are some great family moments in this series, and if you're someone who likes the found family trope, even before we get to the Companions of the Hall, who we are introduced to in the Icewind Dale trilogy, there are still some really great characters who Drizzt becomes really close to within this origin story. Just seeing the origin story of my favourite character, it's always one of those things which is a highlight, but I really enjoyed the actual story itself in here, and the way that everything pulled together to enable you to see how Drizzt became the legendary Dark Elf warrior that he is. Number 7 on the list is sort of a double entry, but we have the Riftwar trilogy by Raymond D. Feist, and following up from that we have the Serpent War quadrilogy by the same author. Now with this one I could include about 30 different books making up 7 or 8 or 9 series that this author has put out in this particular world, but I've gone with essentially the first 2 series in kind of chronological order, because these for me are the best of them. And overall, although I did enjoy all of the books that Raymond D. Feist put out in this kind of extended Midkemia series, often called the Riftwar Cycle or the Riftwar Saga, it's these opening 2, Riftwar and the Serpent War, that really did it for me, and they were some of my origin stories, I suppose, into fantasy. With these 2 series, we have a number of characters who have stayed with me through all of the different series that I have read. Characters like Prince Aruf, Jimmy the Hand, Eric von Darkmoor, and that's a really great sign of a series when, after so many years, I still think about the characters that are involved in these books. A lot of people say that the Empire series, co-written with Janny Wurts, is amongst the best of Raymond E. Feist's works, but for me, I would say the Serpent War is definitely my favourite, closely followed by the Riftwar. And one thing that I do love about the series as a whole is that you do have some characters over the course of those 30 odd books. You do have a couple of characters who you will see throughout each and every one of them. Primarily in there we have the magician himself from the opening book. Although I don't like the name Pug, he is a great character and one of the all-time top magicians in fantasy. At number 6 we have Mistborn Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. I'm specifying Era 1 here because Era 2 is not something that is to my taste, so as far as I'm concerned this is where Mistborn finishes. It is a self-contained trilogy, though there is absolutely no need to read Era 2 if, like me, it's not something that appeals to you. One of the key aspects that people will always talk about with Mistborn is the magic system, and I agree it is one of the things that really sets this series apart from others. The magic itself is really interesting, and when I first read about it, I'd not read any similar magic systems, and for that reason it really stood out from the crowd. The story itself is really well written, it's really easily accessible, and it's one of those series that could definitely be considered an entryway to fantasy because it is so accessible. You don't need any experience in fantasy to be able to read and enjoy this series, because it's not heavy going at all. It's really nice, easy to read, and it has a lot of the typical hallmarks of a great fantasy series. So it's definitely a good introduction to fantasy, but also in its own right, it is a great series as well. And then number 5 in the list, we have The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. The final couple of books in this series, finished off by Brandon Sanderson after the untimely death of the original author. This is a fantastic series which is getting a bit of a second wind with the Amazon Prime live action TV show, and if you haven't read the books, I definitely recommend them. They bring you a whole lot more that you don't get in the TV show. This is a whopper of a series with 14 main novels and a prequel novel to make it 15 in total, and it is pretty famous, I'll have to say, for having what's known as the slog, a few books in the middle which are a bit heavy going and which tend to drag a little bit. Personally for me, I read these quite a while ago and I don't remember having a problem with what's known as the slog. I just enjoyed all of these, although obviously some more than others. What I will say though is these final books with Brandon Sanderson at the helm, they have some absolutely epic scenes in them, and I really loved the finale of the series. Pretty much all through this series we are leading towards this final battle, Tarmangaden, and in this book we have that, and Brandon Sanderson really delivers with it. We have a chapter of something like 100 pages dedicated to this great battle, and I really love how, having built up to it over 13 books to get to this point, the battle isn't just over in a short space of time. It definitely gets everything it deserves. So it's a really great series, so many different great characters. There's pretty much something for everyone here, because let's face it, there's enough page count for there to be something for everyone. In at number 4, and we have the Rhaenyra Revelations by Michael J. Sullivan. This series has got some of the best characters in my fantasy experience. I love the bromance between our main characters, Royce and Hadrian. The banter that we have is almost second to none in all the fantasy series that I've read, so I really love that. The story that they go through, the adventures that they get up to, are really interesting as well. These books that I have are the bind-ups. There are 2 stories in each, so it's technically 6 books that make up this series, although they are more commonly found in the traditional published format where it takes the form of a trilogy. I love the way that everything pulls together in here, and you can see the elements weaving together from the start to the finish of this series, with various revelations, no pun intended, opening up as the series goes along. And this one, the final book in the bind-up trilogy that makes up Rhaenyra Revelations, was one of my favourite books and one of the highest rated books in my Hall of Fame. I love the ending that we got here. I loved the kind of conclusion to the story of Royce and Hadrian. I thought it was really well done and a really thoroughly enjoyable read. Into the top 3, and at number 3, if we're talking about bromance, I give you The Greatcoats by Sebastian de Castell. In here we have another of the all-time great bromances in fantasy, where this time we have 3, Thalkio, Kest and Brasti, and they are the Greatcoats that make up the series name. There are plenty of other Greatcoats who we come across at various points as the series goes by, but those are our 3 main characters. I love this series, and again some of the banter that we get from these 3 as the story goes on. I have to say that this is the one series in this list, and indeed of all the fantasy series that I've read, that's managed to bring a tear to my eye. I don't typically tend to find that I will cry at books, but there are so many uplifting moments in here and some of the great motivational speeches that really tugged on my heartstrings and made me choke up. I love this series. I'm looking forward to the continuation with a new series coming out hopefully in 2022 or 2023, I can't remember which. But in the meantime, The Greatcoats, if you haven't read it, this one is quite short. The other books are a bit longer, but it is a fantastic, quick-paced, fun adventure. Number 2 on my list, my favourite fantasy series of all time. We have The Shadows of Yapt by Adrian Tchaikovsky. I've talked about this series quite a bit because I find it such a unique series. I love the characters in here. It's another series where the characters have stayed with me over a long period of time, but the main thing that does it for me is the world building in this series. I love the ingenuity that we have with all of these different insect kingdom, which are basically, as you can see from the cover art, they are to all outward appearances humans, but they have special abilities, special traits that they have inherited from their totem insect. So some of them can fly, they can climb things that we wouldn't normally be able to climb as humans. They have various powers of the mind, various weapons that they can draw on from their totem insect. And I love that about this series. Now, although it doesn't normally appeal to me, this is a series that also draws on the kind of industrial revolution. These cultures are going through changes, they are developing new technology, but I love the way that it's worked in here with clockwork and early steam power, and the challenges that that gives as some of our characters are able to use technology, some of them aren't, and that's another really interesting element. Overall, I thought it was a really intriguing story. It's a 10-book series and it held my attention throughout the entire series. There are a couple of sub-arcs within that. It's typically broken up into the first 4 books, the last 3 books, and then the 3 books in between. But overall, it's a continuous story throughout those, with some characters that we will see from start to finish and a whole host of different characters coming and going in the meantime. I love this series. It's definitely one of the all-time greats for me, even if it is still a little bit underrated overall. And then, in case anybody doesn't know this about me already, number 1, my all-time favourite series that I still just cannot see anything beating in the future. It's The Faithful and Fallen by John Gwynne. I will tag on to this the follow-up series of Blood and Bone, because I do tend to think of them as one complete series of 7 books rather than a 4 and a 3. This one though, I've said before that for me, John Gwynne writes some of the best battle scenes and probably for me the best animal companions that I have read, and those 2 elements are really key elements because of the importance that they have in these series. I love the writing, I love the characters, I love the overall storyline. It is a proper good versus evil with pretty much angels against demons within this series, and I like that we have on both sides of this different races. It's not just humans and it's not just your typical elves and dwarves that you tend to have. Probably the main race, other than the Kadashim and the Benalim, these angels and demons, we do also have giants, and I just love the thought of these great big giants with their massive weapons riding into battle on a giant bear. It is a sight that I just imagine as being absolutely amazing. Overall, I love the fact that this series is one that can be read as one book. There is no let up between the end of one book and the start of the next, and if you do have the opportunity to read them back to back, I can only imagine that that must be truly amazing. I didn't, I read them when they came out, so I had a gap in between them, but although I'm not a rereader of books, I am definitely tempted to reread the entirety of the Banished Lands saga, starting off with The Faithful and Fallen, and just read them back to back for that experience. This is one that has stayed with me and will continue to stay with me, and as I say, I can see very few things that would even challenge for a spot at the top of the pile for me, because The Faithful and Fallen is just that good. So there we have my top 10 completed fantasy series for 2022. I'm sure I'll revisit this again next year and see what new series have moved on to the list and see what changes there have otherwise been. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of these titles. Was there anything that surprised you? Is there anything from your experience and your knowledge of my tastes that you think might challenge for a spot on this top 10 list? As usual, down in the description box below you can find all of the links to my social media, my Amazon wishlist, my Ko-fi page. Whilst you're down there, give this video a like if you've appreciated the content, subscribe if you haven't already done so. I hope to see you again in another video soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books, bye for now.